Iran under the rule of Reza Shah. Having seized the Shah's throne, Reza Shah, strengthening his dictatorship, continued to fight for the centralization of the country. Against those representatives of the feudal aristocracy and feudal khans, especially khans of nomadic tribes, who showed signs of disobedience or simply enjoyed great influence. Many of them were executed or thrown into prison. Khan detachments were disarmed and liquidated. It was also begun to disarm the nomadic tribes and to forcibly transfer them to a settled way of life. Some tribes moved to other areas. Pursuing a policy of centralization and subjugation of the outlying feudal khans, Reza Shah undertook the construction of highways that connected the outskirts with the center. In order to strengthen the central authority and limit the rights of governors general who govern large provinces, the administrative division of the country was changed. First, large provinces were liquidated. Then, in 1938, the country was divided into 49 shakristans, regions, provinces, which were united into 10 astans, provinces. The rights of governors were curtailed. Governors were appointed not by representatives of local influential khans, as was the case before, but by protégés of Reza Shah from the center. The land holdings of some representatives of the feudal aristocracy and nomadic khans were confiscated and passed into the hands of the Shah himself and his supporters, the military officials. Landowners, merchants. Reza Shah himself, under various pretexts, took possession of vast land holdings in the most fertile provinces of Iran, Mazandaran, Khorasan, Kermanshah and Gorgan, Astrabad, and became the largest landowner in Iran. The number of landowners who did not come from the feudal aristocracy increased. Reza Shah issued a number of laws on the agrarian issue, which replaced the obsolete and no longer consistent with the conditions of Iran. The norms of the Quran and Sharia and strengthened land ownership. The Land Registration Law of 1928, the Civil Code of 1929, and other laws formalized the right of private ownership of land and legally formalized for the landowners the land seized by them or acquired on the basis of the sale and purchase of land. In order to expand land ownership, a circular of 1930 was issued by the Ministry of Finance on the leasing of state lands, and in 1934 a law on the sale of these lands. In 1930, a law on the cadastre was adopted, which established favorable rates for landowners and a system for levying taxes on land and livestock. Taxes were established and collected in cash. For landowners who cultivated industrial crops, tax incentives were established. In 1930, an agricultural department was established under the National Bank organized in 1928, and then, on the basis of a law adopted by the Majlis in 1931, a special agricultural bank was opened. These banks provided financial assistance to the landowners by issuing loans on favorable terms, 4% per annum, against the security of real property, land, for irrigation work. Expanding the crops of industrial crops, etc. Many landlords, receiving loans from the bank, gave this money to the peasants for conditions of high, usurious interest. In order to protect landlord and bourgeois property, a judicial reform was carried out in 1927 to 1928. And a number of laws were issued, the Criminal Code of 1927, the law against violent seizures of land in 1930, the law against the peasant movement in 1931, etc. As a result of all these measures, land ownership in Iran was significantly strengthened, and feudal serf survivals in agriculture remained inviolable. The overwhelming majority of the peasants had no land and were forced to work on the lands of the landowners, who, as a rule, owned both water, and often also draft animals and seeds. The harvest between the landowner and the peasant was still divided on the basis of the old medieval formula. One part for land, another for water, a third for working cattle, a fourth for seeds, and a fifth for labor power, for the peasant. The peasant was forced to give the landowner from 2 to 4/5 of the crop, and in addition, to perform natural duties, to supply eggs, oil and fuel. This medieval, feudal relationship between the peasant and the landlord was also matched by an unusually backward agricultural technique. The main tools of labor were a wooden plough with an iron tip, a wooden harrow with stone and less often iron teeth, a shovel and a hoe. Agricultural machinery was almost completely absent. The peasants lived in extreme poverty. They led a half-starved existence, were almost completely illiterate, and deprived of the most elementary medical care. The conditions of the peasants of the southern regions of Iran were especially difficult. In some southern regions, the coast of the Persian Gulf, Balochistan, etc., many inhabitants ate date stones and dried locusts. Such living conditions, of course, caused discontent and indignation of the peasants. The policy of forcible disarmament of the tribes and their transfer to settled life led to the mass death of livestock, which was the main source of livelihood for nomads. Many Khans were executed, arrested or expelled, and their place was taken by the military authorities and the gendarmes of Reza Shah, who oppressed and robbed the nomads even more than the Khans. Such a policy aroused the hatred of the nomads for Reza Shah, who suppressed their speeches and uprisings with merciless cruelty. At the same time, in the interests of the landlord bourgeois elite, certain measures were taken that, to a certain extent, limited the rights and privileges of foreign subjects, created the prerequisites for the development of national Iranian industry, and were aimed at preserving, within certain limits, the independence of Iran. In 1927, an agreement on guarantees and neutrality, based on mutual equality and common interests, was concluded between the USSR and Iran, confirming the inviolability of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921. Based on the refusal of the Soviet government to capitulate, the Iranian government cancelled the regime on May 10, 1928 capitulations, and in relation to other foreign states and their subjects. In the same year, a law on the introduction of an autonomous customs tariff was adopted. The USSR was the first foreign state to recognize this measure of the Iranian government. Following the USSR, the capitalist powers were also forced to do this. In May 1930, the right to issue was transferred from the English Shahanshah Bank to the Iranian National Bank, founded in 1928, which began to perform the functions of a state bank. Laws were passed on exemption from duties on imported cars. On assistance to national Iranian industrial enterprises, newly organized factories were exempted for 10 years from paying duties and road fees on raw materials and chemical products imported from abroad, and other protectionist laws. During the years of the world economic crisis, 1929 to 1932, foreign trade, especially exports from Iran, fell sharply. The foreign trade balance was always passive, and during these years its passivity increased so much that it began to threaten Iran with a financial and economic catastrophe. In order to establish a balance in the trade balance, and, if possible, to activate it, as well as to strengthen the exchange rate of the Iranian currency and patronize the national industry. On February 25, 1931, a law on the monopoly of foreign trade was adopted, which declared foreign trade, and export and import, a monopoly government. This law, as well as an additional law of March 11, 1931, provided for the establishment of import contingents to Iran and the issuance of licenses. The government could transfer to individual merchants or their societies a monopoly on the import and export of certain goods. On the basis of these laws, monopoly societies of merchants for export and import were organized, which conducted foreign trade. The capitalist states met with great dissatisfaction the establishment of a foreign trade monopoly by Iran. But, relying on the support of the Soviet Union, which, concluding a new trade agreement with Iran in 1931, fully recognized the Iranian monopoly of foreign trade, Iran was able to achieve recognition of this measure by other states. It goes without saying that the monopoly of foreign trade introduced by Reza Shah in Iran had nothing in common with the socialist monopoly of foreign trade that exists in the USSR. If in the Soviet Union the monopoly of foreign trade is exercised by the socialist state and aims to ensure the interests of the socialist national economy and the interests of the entire Soviet people, then the monopoly of foreign trade in Iran established by Reza Shah was an attempt to protect the interests of the foreign trade connected with foreign trade in conditions of the world economic crisis. Bourgeois ruling Iranian elite. It should also be borne in mind that Reza Shah sought to use the law on the monopoly of foreign trade to limit trade relations with the USSR. The construction of a modern machine industry began in 1930. A characteristic feature of the emerging Iranian industry was the desire of Reza Shah to seize the most profitable enterprises. Many new industrial enterprises, in particular large textile factories in Mazandaran, belonged to the state or Reza Shah personally. First of all, the textile industry and the processing of agricultural raw materials developed. In total, by 1940, there were about 25 large cotton factories in Iran, about 200,000 spindles, and 8 large wool weaving factories, about 25,000 spindles. The largest center of the textile industry is Isfahan, where there are 9 large textile factories with over 10,000 workers. Large textile factories were also built in Shohi, Beshar, Shalis, Mazandaran, Mashhad, Avaz, Shiraz, Katan, Yezd and Tehran. 8 large sugar factories were also launched with the actual productivity of all factories up to 35,000 tons of sugar per year, several dozen large mills, rice and cotton gins. A large tobacco factory in Tehran, tanneries in Tabriz, match factories and other enterprises. In addition, several military factories, cement and glycerine plants were built in the Tehran region. In the north of Iran, in the Elburz Mountains, coal deposits began to be developed. In the years before the Second World War, the construction of the first heavy industry enterprises began. A metallurgical plant in Aminabad and the Ganyabad copper smelter near Tehran, the Anarek non-ferrous metal plant, northeast of Yezd. The imperialists thwarted the construction of these enterprises. During the period from 1930 to the Second World War, the share of industry and its products in the national economy of Iran increased significantly. The number of registered commercial, industrial, and other joint stock companies increased from 93 in 1932 to 1,902 in 1942, and their capital in the same years increased accordingly from 143,009,000 rials to 2,239,810,000. According to official data published in 1946, in the Journal of the Ministry of Labor and Propaganda, 1,300 million rials were invested in Iranian industry at the prices of 1938-39, which at the rate of 1938-39, 1 F.St. equals 80.5 rials, was only £16,250,000 art, of which the share of state-owned enterprises, which included enterprises that belonged personally to Reza Shah before his abdication, accounted for about 550 million rials, without capital invested in state-owned military plants and in the construction of metallurgical enterprises. Factory industry increased from 9.5% of the country's total production in 1936-37, about 690 million rials. All production was tentatively estimated this year at 7,112 million rials, to 18.6% of the country's total production in 1940-41, about 1,356 million rials. All the country's products this year were tentatively estimated at 7,373 million rials. Thus, in the years before the war there was some development of industry. However, one should not exaggerate the importance of industrial construction under Reza Shah. This is especially clear from a comparison of investment in the Iranian national industry with the capital and profits of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. AINK's capital, currently valued at about £200 million. Art, more than 12 times the total amount of investment in Iranian industry, and AINK's profit, received only in 1950 alone, about £150 million street, is almost 10 times greater than these investments. Industrial construction was carried out not in the interests of the normal development of the country's economy and meeting the needs of the people, but in the interests of strengthening the dictatorship of Reza Shah and enriching the landlord bourgeois elite associated with Reza Shah. For example, huge sums were spent on the construction of a factory for the production of gas masks and other military factories. Meanwhile, these factories did not bring any benefit to Iran. In the last years before the war, almost all industrial construction in Iran was seized with the assistance of Reza Shah by the German imperialists, who acted by no means in the interests of Iran and the development of its economy, using their stay in Iran to conduct fascist propaganda and turn Iranian territory into a base for sabotage and espionage anti-Soviet activities. The German fascist agents, with the connivance of Reza Shah, recklessly designed the construction of industrial enterprises, artificially inflated the cost, and did not meet the deadlines for completing construction. This was especially evident in the example of the construction of the Koreds ironworking plant and the Anorik non-ferrous metal plant, which was completely given by Reza Shah into the hands of the German monopolies. About 318 million rials were invested in the construction of the Koreds ironworks, which, according to an agreement with the Krupp Consortium, was to be completed by May 1940. But the plant was never launched. Large investments were also made in the construction of the Anorik plant, without the necessary preliminary exploration of ores. Subsequently, it turned out that a large number of machines and equipment ordered from Germany, as well as a large staff of Germans who received huge salaries, did not correspond to the explored or reserves. In the end, an agreement with a German, by which firms on the construction of the plant was cancelled and measures were taken to curtail work in the Anna River. So the German fascists disrupted the formations under the auspices of the Koreds plant and the Anorik plant. Construction of metallurgical enterprises. Provo. Reza Shah did it in such a way that it corresponded only to the interests of fascist Germany and brought nothing to Iran but harm and unnecessary expenses, without bringing any benefit to the people, the industrial system. The government doomed him to additional hardships. Construction and organization of other industries. Mindsets were also staged very badly. The cost of products of Iranian factories and plants, as a rule, was much higher than the cost of the same products in other countries. In terms of quality, Iranian products were much lower than foreign ones. The production capacity of factories and factories newly built in Iran was used in most cases insignificantly. Iranian industry had a pronounced semi-colonial character. The miserable state of Iran's national industry was the result of the predatory policy of the imperialist powers. The British capitalists, who seized the most important wealth of the country, oil, as well as the German and American imperialists, tried in every possible way to disorganize the economy of Prana and prevent the development of industry in order to prepare the conditions for the complete subjugation and enslavement of Iran. In particular, they tried to disrupt the construction of heavy industry enterprises, which could to some extent serve as a basis for strengthening the economic independence of Iran. In 1928, the Iranian government, having introduced special indirect taxes for this purpose, began the construction of the Trans-Iranian Railway, connecting the port of Bandar Shah on the Persian Gulf with the port of Bandar Shah on the Caspian Sea. Thus, the northern section of the Trans-Iranian Railway went to the Soviet border in the deserted southeastern corner of the Caspian Sea in Bandar Shah. This territory was loosely connected with the USSR. Such an exit to the north of the Trans-Iranian Railway was planned by Reza Shah specifically in order to isolate Iran from the USSR, if possible, at least from its more developed areas, and to prevent the use of the railway to strengthen economic ties between Iran and the USSR, although this contrary to the interests of Iran's economic development. This road, about 1,400 kilometers long, crossing a series of high mountain ranges, the Zagros Mountains, the Elburz Range, and having several hundred bridges and tunnels along its length, was completed and put into operation in 1938. Then the construction of iron roads connecting Tehran with Tabriz and Mashhad. The length of the entire Iranian railway network increased by 1947 to 2,800 kilometers. A network of highways for road transport was also built with a total length of about 20,000 kilometers. In addition, work was carried out on the reconstruction of cities and in particular Tehran, where several new government buildings were built, National Bank, Police Department, etc. The northern part of Tehran, where the landowners, bourgeoisie, and officials mainly live, was almost completely rebuilt. Many streets were covered with asphalt, houses of a modern type were built, etc. The southern part of the city, inhabited mainly by workers and other working people, was left without any changes. Adobe or adobe houses and shacks, narrow, crooked, dirty and stinking streets, terrible crowding, lack of drinking water, etc. The workers and the urban poor lived in appalling conditions. A significant part of them huddled not even in clay shacks, but in covered pits dug in the ground, in terrible unsanitary conditions. Even the capital of Iran, not to mention other cities, did not have sewage and water supply, and the vast majority of the population was forced to use dirty ditch water, which was released every 2 to 3, or even 4 weeks through ditches, which also served as a dumping ground for garbage and sewage. Industrial, road and urban construction led to the growth of Iran's working class. According to the Iranian press, by the beginning of the Second World War there were already about 500,000 workers of various specialties in Iran. The position of the workers was extremely difficult. Labor legislation, labor protection, and social insurance were absent. The working day lasted 10 to 12 hours and even more. Child labor was widely used in the textile and other industries. The workers received a meager wage of a few rials a day, allowing them to lead only a beggarly existence. Women received about half as much as men, and children half as much as women. Along with industrial and road construction, during the reign of Reza Shah, some top events were held in the field of public education, culture and life. According to official Iranian data, the total number of students increased from 55,000 in 1923 to 233,700 in 1938. Tehran University was founded in 1934. In addition, an agricultural institute in Kerej and a pedagogical institute in Tehran were founded. In total, in 1938, there were only 4,200 students in all higher educational institutions in Iran. The network of educational institutions was completely inadequate. Many schools were in the hands of foreigners. Thus, in 1938, 24 secondary schools were in the hands of the Americans, the French, and others. Education in schools was a privilege only for the children of the landowners, the bourgeoisie, and officials. The broad masses of the people, peasants and workers, were mostly deprived of the opportunity to educate their children in schools. The percentage of literate people among the population was negligible. In 1935, a decree was issued on the obligatory removal of the veil. By order of the Shah, the police pursued women who appeared on the streets in a veil. Women began to be admitted to higher educational institutions and to work in state institutions. Women's and mixed women's and men's schools were created. But women were still deprived of voting rights, and the question of equalizing their rights with men was not even raised. Women's work, as mentioned above, was paid much lower than men's. In order to strengthen his dictatorship, Reza Shah limited the influence of the clergy in the socio-political life of the country. The clergy were deprived of judicial power. His influence in the field of public education was also undermined. A large number of schools were removed from the jurisdiction of the clergy and transferred to the Ministry of Education. Land holdings of the clergy, land ownership, were reduced. Attempts by the clergy to resist these measures were resolutely rebuffed by Reza Shah. The government registered the clergy, defrocked some of them, and took a number of other repressive measures. Some prominent clerics, such as Modaz, the leader of the clerical opposition, were arrested and killed in prison. As a result, the clergy stopped the open struggle against Reza Shah. Following the example of Turkey, a clothing reform was carried out and a European costume was introduced. First, in 1928, the wearing of the traditional Persian headdress, kular, was banned, instead of which the so-called Pahlavi hat was introduced, kular Pahlavi. Then the wearing of this hat was also cancelled. Instead, it was ordered to introduce European headgear, hats for employees of government agencies, and caps for the military. These measures were carried out in accordance with the order of Reza Shah, and those who resisted were dealt with severely. So, for example, on the orders of Reza Shah in 1936, in Mashhad, machine gun fire was opened at several thousand people, who got into the best in the mosque of Imam Reza, in protest against the police massacres, during the implementation of the Shah's order to replace the headgear. Lush feudal titles were officially abolished and surnames were introduced according to the Turkish model. All these events were carried out under the flag of ardent nationalism. The ideas of the revival of the ancient greatness of Iran, the restoration of its former power and strength were promoted. Associated with this wave of nationalism was the adoption of the name Pahlavi for the new Reza Shah dynasty, which they tried to associate with the Parthian dynasty that ruled Iran in antiquity. When Iran was one of the most powerful states in the world, the decision of the Iranian government in 1935 to change the name in official diplomatic correspondence Persia by Iran, renaming a number of cities, changing the chronology system, switching to a solar year, introducing old Iranian names of months, and other events. The bright stamp of nationalism also lay on the reform of the Persian language, carried out at the initiative of the Iranian government. This reform was carried out under the leadership of the Iranian Academy of Sciences, Farkhangistan, formed in 1937. It consisted in the fact that many Turkish, Arabic and European words, which had long since come into use and become an organic part of the language, were forcibly removed from the Persian language. Instead of them, either Old Persian, long forgotten and out of use, or artificially contrived words were introduced. At the same time, the question of replacing the complex Arabic alphabet with the Latin one was hampered. The language reform carried out in this way did not in the least facilitate the cultural development of the broad masses of the people. Nationalism, characteristic of Reza Shah's domestic policy, was especially pronounced in his policy towards non-Iranian peoples and tribes inhabiting Iran. Despite the presence in Iran of a large number of non-Iranian tribes and nationalities speaking languages completely different from the Persian language, Reza Shah did not recognize the existence of national minorities in Iran, declaring most of these tribes and nationalities, all tribes and nationalities professing Islam, belonging to an Iranian nation that doesn't really exist. Only Armenians, Jews and other non-Muslim peoples were recognized as non-Iranian. Reza Shah carried out the forced Persianization of national minorities. The policy of forcibly transferring nomadic tribes to settled life, and their resettlement in other areas also partially pursued this goal. In areas inhabited by non-Iranian tribes and nationalities, Persian schools were opened and teaching was conducted only in the state Persian language, which was incomprehensible to the local population. Judicial proceedings were conducted in the same language, etc. Elections to the Majlis were held without any regard for national conditions. National minorities, with the exception of Armenians and Jews, did not have the right to send their representatives to the Majlis. The administrative apparatus, and especially the highest in regions and districts inhabited by non-Persians, was, as a rule, staffed by landowners, the bourgeoisie officials, and the military of the Persians, the dominant people in Iran, who pursued a policy of brutal national oppression of these peoples and tribes. They grossly violated the culture, customs and national dignity of non-Iranian peoples and tribes, as well as those Iranian tribes and peoples that differ from the Persians in language, way of life, culture and other characteristics, for example, Kurds, Lurs, Bakhtiyars, Balochs, etc. Thus, Reza Shah pursued a policy of great power Iranian chauvinism in the interests of the Iranian landowners and the bourgeoisie. Iran under Reza Shah was a gloomy prison of peoples, where the most elementary rights of national minorities were violated. Reza Shah pursued a policy of severe repression against the workers, peasants and democratic movements in general. The dissatisfaction of the peasants manifested itself in the form of a spontaneous partisan struggle against the landowners, which almost never died down. The following year, after the capture of Reza by the Shah of the throne, a wave of peasant and soldier uprisings swept through Iran. The uprisings of the soldiers also reflected the mood of the peasants. In June 1926, soldiers rebelled in Dilmun, now Sharpa, Azerbaijan, and the peasants joined them. In Gilan, in the forest region of Fumen, fugitive soldiers, with the support of peasants and artisans, organized partisan detachments, and fought against the Shah's authorities and landlords. The most significant uprising of 1926 was the military uprising in the Turkmen steppe. The uprising was held under the slogan of the struggle for freedom and the overthrow of Reza Shah. The rebellious soldiers of the garrison of the town of Moravatip, supported by the peasants and the urban population, occupied the cities of Bojnurd, Shirvan and Kuchin. They arrested khans and landowners, distributed bread to the poor from the landlord and state warehouses. The reactionary landlords and officials fled the area of the uprising. All the peasant and soldier uprisings of 1926 in Azerbaijan, Gilan and Khorasan were suppressed by the troops of Reza Shah with extraordinary cruelty. Dozens of participants in the movement were hanged and shot. The British actively helped Reza Shah in suppressing these uprisings. So, for example, to suppress the Khorasan uprising, troops were transferred on English trucks. The British provided the punitive expedition with machine guns and other weapons, as well as aircraft. A new wave of peasant uprisings and tribal uprisings took place in Iran in 1929 to 1930, when, due to the world economic crisis, the situation of the peasants worsened even more. Due to the fall in demand for agricultural products in Iran, the sown area has significantly decreased. Shifting the burden of the crisis onto the shoulders of the peasantry, the landowners increased their fees, and the government increased indirect taxes. All this sharply worsened the situation of the peasants and contributed to their even greater impoverishment. In Khorasan, a peasant partisan movement unfolded under the leadership of Zulfu, who called himself a wandering Padishah, and put forward a demand for the abolition of the opium monopoly, on the basis of the law on opium monopoly. Officials took away the entire poppy crop from the peasants at reduced prices, etc. In the southern regions of Iran, there were peasant uprisings led by Mahdi Sorki, as well as uprisings of the Kashkai and Bakhshia tribes and the Kuk-Kilu tribes. Deprived by Reza of their former power, the leaders of nomadic tribes and the clergy, using the discontent of the tribes, raised them to fight against centralization. The forced transfer of tribes to settled life and the innovations of the government, judicial reform, universal military service, the introduction of European clothes. Reza Shah sent punitive expeditions against these speeches and uprisings, which suppressed them with the usual cruelty. From July to December 1932 alone, more than 150 participants in the peasant movement were shot, hundreds of them were sent to hard labor, prisons and exile in remote eastern regions. The khans of the Kashkai, Bakhshia, and other rebellious tribes were also massacred. In particular, the leader of the Kashkai tribe Sulat ed-Dol and the Bakhshia Khan Sadr Asad were killed in the Tehran prison. As early as 1925 the Communist Party and trade unions were forced to go underground. After that, the labor movement in Iran temporarily subsided. A new wave of labor movement arose in 1929 in connection with the onset of the world economic crisis, which further worsened the position of the working class. The growth of unemployment, the deterioration of working conditions, the extension of the working day sometimes up to 15 hours a day, the reduction of wages, the system of fines, the growth of poverty among the workers, all this revolutionized the workers and led to an intensification of the class struggle. In May 1929, a mass strike of workers in the oil fields of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, unprecedented in Iran in terms of the number of participants, broke out. The striking workers, along with economic demands, increasing wages, shortening the working day, providing for workers who lost their ability to work, and the families of those who died at work at the company, also put forward political demands, recognition of the trade union, official recognition of May 1st as a working holiday, release of arrested workers, etc. British soldiers and troops of the Iranian government were moved against the strikers, and the strike was crushed. In 1930, there were riots at a match factory in Tabriz and a strike of railroad workers in Mazandaran. In 1931, a strike took place at the Vatan textile factory in Isfahan, the second largest after the strike of oil workers in 1929. Preparations for this strike were carried out for several months. A workers' union and mutual benefit funds were organized. Iranian communists led the strike. As a result of good preparation and organization, the strike ended in victory for the workers, who achieved a reduction in the working day to 9 hours, an increase in wages by 20%. The abolition of searches that were humiliating for workers, a reduction in fines and other concessions. But immediately after the end of the strike, the authorities began arresting worker activists. Reza Shah took extremely brutal measures to suppress the labor movement. Members of the labor movement were arrested by the hundreds, held in prison without trial, and deported to the southern and eastern outlying regions. In May 1931, a special law was passed against communists who continued to fight underground, which, under penalty of 10 years in prison with strict isolation, prohibited communist activities. Trade unions were also banned. In an address to the workers of the whole world on July 20, 1931, the plenum of the Executive Committee of the Anti-Imperialist League wrote, "More than 2,000 political prisoners are being tortured in Persian prisons. The Pahlavi government does not recognize any court for them. The revolutionary workers' organizations are under the most severe terror." Reza Shah persecuted not only the leaders of the peasant and labor movement, but also every slightest manifestation of opposition and democratic thought. All parties were liquidated, the press was completely unified. A regime of police arbitrariness and a landowner bourgeois dictatorship was established in the country. The constitution and all democratic freedoms were effectively eliminated. The deputies of the Majlis were elected at the behest of Reza Shah, and the Majlis became his obedient instrument. In the field of foreign policy, as mentioned above, the capitulation regime was abolished, and in 1928 an autonomous customs tariff was introduced. This was facilitated primarily by the friendly position of the Soviet Union, which pursued a policy of promoting the strengthening of the economic and political independence of the countries of the East and Iran in particular. The first foreign state to renounce the capitulation regime and recognize Iran's autonomous customs tariff. However, in the most important issues, the foreign policy of Reza Shah was not determined by the national interests of Iran. Reza Shah and the British who supported him tried to mislead public opinion and present actions that were beneficial to the imperialists in the form of protecting the national interests of Iran. This was the case, for example, in 1932 to 1933. When revising the term of the concession agreement with the British company, which plundered the main natural wealth of Iran and mercilessly exploited Iranian workers. The issue of revising the contract arose in connection with the size of the concession payments made by the company to the treasury of the Iranian government. Through various accounting manipulations, the company artificially underestimated its profits in order to reduce deductions in favor of Iran. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company cut the amount of deductions to Iran especially sharply during the world economic crisis. The company transferred to the Iranian government for 1931 on account of deductions under the contract 16% of profits, £306.8 thousand art. Instead of the paid £1,228.3 thousand art. For 1930. In November 1932, the Iranian government announced the termination of the concession agreement, which expired in 1961. Reza Shah was portrayed by the government press as a fighter for the national interests of Iran. The Anglo-Iranian conflict was referred to the League of Nations. But already on April 29, 1933, the Iranian government signed a new concession agreement, according to which the concession period was extended until 1993. West of Kermanshah through Luristan, Bakhti area, the cities of Sedabad and Bampur, and to the border with English Balochistan. On this territory, the company could choose to operate plots with a total area of 100,000 square meters miles, about 258,000 kilometers. In addition, the company received the right to purchase land, to build railways, new ports, telephone and telegraph lines, airfields and radio stations. The company was also retained the right to have its own police, schools, etc. under the new agreement, the company undertook to pay the Iranian government instead of 16% of the profits at Fors on every ton of oil sold in or exported from Iran, and in addition 20% of the profits to be distributed to ordinary shares over and above the profits of £671,250 art, but not less than 750,000 art per year, as well as a certain amount in return for taxes in favor of the state. Thus, having agreed to a slight increase in the amount of deductions in favor of Iran and to the limitation of the territory of the company's activities, which at that time did not have significance, the British, with the help of Reza Shah, achieved an extension of the concession period and the preservation of its basic rights and privileges. The fact that Reza Shah, acting in this conflict under the guise of a defender of the national interests of the country, actually acted in the interests of the British imperialists, is evidenced by the reprisal, at the behest of the British, with those Iranian statesmen who tried to defend the interests of Iran and curtail the positions and influence of the British Iranian Oil Company. So, for example, it was precisely for this that, on the orders of Reza Shah, one of the most prominent statesmen of Iran, Minister of the Court Teymourtash, was arrested and poisoned in prison. Materials published in recent years show that Teymourtash, before his arrest, demanded an increase in the company's deductions in favor of Iran, the transfer to Iran of 1/4 of ordinary shares free of charge, the right to receive a share of profits from the company's enterprises in other countries, the right to cancel the concession until 1993, the deprivation of Anglo, the Iranian oil company, with the monopoly right to build and operate oil pipelines, etc. Teymourtash was not the only victim among the political figures of Iran, who fell at the hands of Reza Shah to please the British imperialists. So, for example, the former Minister of War of Iran, the Berkshire Khan Sadr Assad, was arrested and killed in prison, which caused discontent among the British. The conclusion of the Anglo-Iranian agreement on the English Shahanshah Bank was also portrayed as protecting the national interests of Iran, but in fact preserved the position of the imperialists. By agreeing in 1930 to the transfer of the right of issue from the Shahanshah Bank to the National Bank of Iran, the British retained all other rights of their bank and obtained for the bank an additional right to buy, sell and own land. In addition, they received a monetary compensation of £200,000 art in the Anglo-Iranian conflict of 1927 to 1928. On the issue of the Bahrain Islands, which previously belonged to Iran and were actually captured by the British, Reza Shah also limited himself to only formal protests and an appeal to the League of Nations that did nothing for Iran. The Bahrain Islands are the largest in the Persian Gulf and the most strategically important, as the base of the airline between Europe and India and the Far East, archipelago of 5 islands with a total area of 450 square miles with a population of about 250,000 people. The Bahrain Islands are located in the southwestern part of the Persian Gulf, west of the Qatar Peninsula. They are also of great economic importance as a center for pearling, and most importantly, in connection with large oil reserves, which have been exploited since 1932 by the American firm Bahrain Petroleum Company, associated with the oil company Standard Oil. For a long time, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Bahrain Islands were ruled by Iran. From the beginning of the 19th century, the British, taking advantage of the weakness of the Iranian government, began to unceremoniously interfere under the pretext of combating the slave trade in the affairs of Bahrain. Already on May 30, 1847, the British forced the Bahraini Sheikh Mohammed ibn Khalifa to sign an agreement under which the Sheikh was recognized as an independent ruler, and the British government received the right to protect the islands. At the end of the 19th century, the British expelled Sheikh Mohammed from the island and installed his son, their protege Sheikh Issa, as the ruler, who did everything that the British ordered. During the first quarter of the 20th century, the British, having concluded several treaties with Sheikh Issa, established their control over Bahrain. The Iranian government did not recognize British rights to the Bahrain Islands and repeatedly protested against British control over them. In 1927, when concluding the Anglo-Gedges Treaty, the British obliged the ruler of Gejaz and Nejdi ibn Saud not to violate the interests of the sheikhs of Kuwait, Oman and Bahrain, which meant the recognition of England's special rights to these sheikhs. In response to this open recognition by the British of the capture of the Bahrain Islands, Reza Shah limited himself to only a formal note of protest and a complaint to the League of Nations. These formal protests and complaints, of course, could not produce any results, and the Bahrain Islands remained under the British protectorate. In relations with the Soviet Union, which in every possible way contributed to the strengthening of the economic and political independence of Iran, Reza Shah pursued a policy that was contrary to the national interests of Iran, aimed at preventing rapprochement between the two countries. In the second decade of Reza Shah's reign, his foreign policy began to take on an openly anti-Soviet character. In 1937, the Iranian government, together with Turkey, Iraq and Afghanistan, signed the Sardabad Pact, which was to play a significant role in the policy of encircling and isolating the Soviet Union, a policy pursued by the United States, Britain, and other imperialist powers at that time. In 1938, Reza Shah refused to conclude a new trade agreement with the USSR, as a result of which Iran's trade with the USSR, which in 1938 accounted for 38% of all foreign trade turnover of Iran, sharply decreased. In March 1939, contrary to the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921, the Iranian government granted an oil and/or concession to the Dutch company Algemeen Exploration Maatschappij, one of the subsidiaries of the Anglo-Dutch oil concern Royal Dutch Shell, headed by De Terding, a well-known mastermind of interventionist plans against the USSR, which represented one of the British imperialist groupings most hostile to the Soviet Union. In the north of Iran, the concession area came close to Baku. The Dutch company received the right to build airfields, railways, radio stations, telegraph and telephone lines, and fuel bases on the territory of the concession. Thus, by granting this concession, the Iranian ruling circles contributed to the creation of a foothold against the USSR, in particular against the Baku oil region. The policy of Reza Shah became especially clearly anti-Soviet in the last years before the Second World War, when the Shah became more and more close to Nazi Germany, which intensified its penetration into Iran in order to use its territory as a springboard for the implementation of its aggressive plans. After the defeat in the First World War, Germany was ousted from Iran for a number of years. Iranian-German trade almost completely stopped. But already from 1925, Germany began to gradually repenetrate Iran. Since 1924, the German aviation company Junker opened airlines in Iran. After the resignation of the American financial advisor Milspo in 1927, the German Lindenblatt was invited to this position, who was later appointed director of the National Bank of Iran. And another German, Schneewand, was appointed to the post of financial advisor. After the establishment of the fascist regime in Germany, the activity of the Germans in Iran intensified even more. Reza Shah promoted German penetration in trade, industrial and railway construction. As a result, already in 1937-38, Germany occupied the second place in Iran's foreign trade after the USSR. Its share this year was 27%, displacing England, whose share fell to 7%. After the termination of trade relations between Iran and the USSR, as a result of Reza Shah's unwillingness to conclude a new trade agreement with the USSR, Germany in 1938-39 already took first place in Iran's foreign trade, 41.5%. In 1940-41 Germany's share rose to 45.5%. Taking advantage of Iran's currency difficulties, Germany imposed on it a clearing agreement in 1935. Iran found itself in a position dependent on Germany for many imported goods, which were supplied by Germany at very high prices, exceeding world prices, and at the same time in quantities that far did not correspond to the cost of raw materials pumped out of Iran. Using the clearing agreement, in 1939-40 Germany exported goods worth 393 million rials from Iran, but imported only 160 million without paying a single rial. Numerous representatives of various German firms settled in Iran. Germany also took first place in the supply of industrial and railway equipment to Iran. The Germans took a leading part in the construction of the Trans-Iranian Railway and industrial enterprises. They built airfields. German specialists appeared at all important enterprises and institutions, especially state ones, as well as in agriculture. Fascist German agents paid special attention to Iranian military enterprises and institutions. All military factories were actually under the control of the Germans. Germany supplied Iran with various weapons, using these supplies to send its officers to Iran, who, under the guise of instructors, systematically conducted fascist propaganda among Iranian officers and engaged in espionage. Representative offices of German firms also served only as a disguise for Hitler's spies. Under the guise of technical specialists, several thousand Nazi agents and spies operated in Iran. There were especially many of them in the northern provinces of Iran, close to the border with the USSR. The leadership of their activities was carried out by the German envoy in Tehran and the German consuls in the provincial cities. Using demagogic Nazi propaganda about the alleged common Aryan origin of the Germans and Persians, as well as anti-democratic and anti-Soviet sentiments among the Iranian ruling circles. The Nazis managed to recruit some deputies of the Iranian Majlis, generals and officers of the Iranian army, journalists, and others into their service. Fascist leaders repeatedly made trips to Iran to inspect their agents. The Iranian government and Reza Shah, who condoned the activities of fascist agents in Iran, arranged magnificent meetings for the fascist leaders. Fascist literature was very widely distributed in the country. Already on the eve of World War II, fascist agents had made a firm nest for themselves in Iran, settling in government and cultural institutions and industrial enterprises. Their main tasks were to get to Iranian, Mosul and Baku oil, to gain a foothold on the strategically important approaches to the Soviet Transcaucasus, to Iraq and India, and to turn Iran into a vassal of Nazi Germany and into a springboard for an attack on the Soviet Union.